Sharon L. Payne was simply enjoying a sunny afternoon, walking through the city's busy shopping district. The people passing by had no idea that the young woman in the plain gray t-shirt was not just an ordinary shopper, but the daughter of the city's most respected and formidable civil rights judge. Sharon was dressed casually and looked just like any other regular civilian out for the day. She was taking a personal afternoon off to clear her mind before a major community gala. Sharon had decided that for this walk, she would go out not as a prominent figure's daughter, but simply as herself. As she browsed a boutique window, a shop assistant nearby whispered to a colleague, "I hope that woman in the blazer doesn't come in here. Every time she's on this block, trouble follows." Sharon turned and asked the assistant, "What do you mean? Who is she?" The assistant replied nervously, "That's Marcia Miller. She's wealthy, influential, and has a habit of making false accusations against anyone she doesn't like the look of. She always has Officer Collins on speed dial. He doesn't care about the truth. He just does whatever she says to keep her happy. I just hope nobody crosses her path today, or that officer will make them regret it without them ever doing a single thing wrong." The midday sun beat down on the pavement as Sharon stood near the boutique, still processing the shop assistant's warning. The peace of her afternoon vanished the moment a sharp, manicured finger pointed directly at her chest. Marcia T. Miller, draped in a dark blazer that screamed of expensive taste and unearned superiority, stepped into Sharon's personal space with a look of pure coldness. "There she is, officer," Marcia declared, her voice cutting through the ambient city noise like a blade. "I saw her slip the bracelet into her pocket. She thinks because she's dressed like a vagrant, she can just take what she wants." Sharon looked down at her simple gray t-shirt and then back at the woman, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. She hadn't even entered the store yet. Before Sharon could utter a single word of defense, the heavy tread of combat boots echoed against the sidewalk. Officer Drew P. Collins approached, his posture rigid and his hand resting suggestively near his belt. He didn't look at the security cameras or ask for a witness. He simply looked at Marcia's dark blazer and then at Sharon's plain attire, making an immediate, biased judgment. "All right, hand it over," Collins barked, his voice filled with an authoritative gravel that brooked no argument. Sharon took a steadying breath, trying to remain calm. "Officer, I don't know what this woman is talking about. I haven't been inside that shop. You can check the tapes or search my bags," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to surge through her veins. Marcia let out a sharp, mocking laugh and stepped closer to the officer, lightly touching his arm as if they were old allies. "She's lying, Drew. They always lie when they're caught. Are you really going to let this little thief talk back to you in public? It's embarrassing." The encouragement from the wealthy woman seemed to act as a catalyst for Collins's temper. He felt the eyes of the gathering crowd on him. Dozens of people had stopped, their smartphones already raised to capture the unfolding drama. Instead of de-escalating, Collins felt the need to assert his dominance. He stepped into Sharon's personal space, his face inches from hers. "You've got a big mouth for someone about to head to a cell," he hissed, his face turning a shade of frustrated red. Sharon didn't flinch. She had spent her life watching her father uphold the law with integrity, and seeing it twisted into a weapon of personal spite sparked a grim determination in her eyes. "I am not moving, and I am not giving you anything, because I haven't broken the law," she stated firmly. "You are violating my rights based on a false report, and you know it." The mention of rights seemed to be the final straw for Collins. In his mind, he wasn't an officer of the law in that moment. He was the law. In one swift, forceful motion, Collins raised his hand. The sound of the impact, the sharp, fleshy crack of a palm against a cheek, was so loud it seemed to silence the entire street for a heartbeat. Sharon's head snapped to the side, her eyes snapping shut from the sheer force of the blow. She stumbled back, the sting of the slap radiating across her face, but she didn't scream. Beside them, Marcia T. Miller didn't look horrified. Instead, a composed, satisfied smile spread across her face, her eyes glinting with the approval of a woman who had just seen her will enforced by a badge. The crowd gasped, a collective murmur of outrage rising as the red mark began to bloom on Sharon's skin. Collins stood over her, his hand still vibrating from the strike, his rigid posture suggesting he felt entirely justified in his unchecked display of authority. He had no idea that every lens pointed at him had just recorded the end of his career. Marcia T. Miller didn't flinch at the violence she had just orchestrated. Instead, she leaned in closer, her dark blazer brushing against Officer Collins's light blue sleeve as she prepared to solidify her deception. "You saw it yourself, officer," she said, her voice dripping with a practiced, fraudulent urgency that sounded like a scripted performance. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out an empty velvet jewelry box, holding it up like a trophy for the growing crowd of onlookers to see. This girl snatched a vintage diamond heirloom right off the display while the clerk was distracted. "It has been in my family for 3 generations, and I watched her shove it into the waistband of those cheap trousers." Sharon L. Payne, still feeling the burning sting of the officer's palm against her face, looked at the empty box and then at the woman's composed, satisfied expression. "That's a lie," Sharon said, her voice low but vibrating with a cold, focused anger. "I haven't even stepped foot over the threshold of that boutique. I was standing right here, looking at the window display, when she approached me." Officer Drew P. Collins didn't even turn his head toward the store entrance, where the shop assistant stood frozen in the doorway. His rigid posture remained fixed on Sharon, his eyes filled with a narrow-minded disdain that saw only a suspect and not a citizen. "I've heard enough from you," he snapped, his voice a harsh bark that cut through Sharon's attempt to defend herself. He took a step toward her, his hand moving toward the handcuffs on his belt with a sense of predatory confidence. Sharon gestured toward the high-definition security camera mounted directly above the boutique sign, its lens pointed toward the very spot where she had been standing. "The truth is right there, officer. If you take 30 seconds to look at that footage, you'll see that I never went inside and that this woman is making a false report. Why won't you just check the cameras?" Collins let out a sharp, mocking grunt, his face twisting into a sneer that mirrored Marcia's arrogance. "I don't need a camera to tell me what's standing right in front of my face," he replied, dismissing the most objective evidence available with a wave of his hand. "Mrs. Miller is a pillar of this community, a regular at the precinct, and a woman of status. You're just a girl in a t-shirt looking for a payday. I'm not wasting the department's time reviewing tapes for a clear-cut case of grand larceny." Marcia nodded in approval, her expression one of faint, composed satisfaction as she watched the officer disregard every protocol of a fair investigation. She knew that on this street, in this moment, the officer's bias was more powerful than the truth. As the crowd's smartphones continued to capture every word, Collins grabbed Sharon roughly by the arm, refusing to acknowledge the digital eyes that were already transmitting his professional downfall to the rest of the world. The air on the busy city street grew thick with a different kind of tension as the sound of the slap echoed away, replaced by the collective murmur of a dozen witnesses. Officer Drew P. Collins remained locked in his rigid stance, his chest puffed out with a sense of unchecked authority, completely oblivious to the sea of glass and silicon rising around him. While he kept his eyes fixed on Sharon, refusing to see her as anything more than a criminal, the crowd had become a silent jury, their arms extended as they held up smartphones like mirrors to his misconduct. The diverse group of onlookers didn't just watch. They documented every detail, from the red mark deepening on Sharon's cheek to the composed, satisfied smile playing on Marcia T. Miller's lips. Collins seemed to believe that his badge made him invisible to the consequences of the digital age, behaving as if the street were his private stage rather than a public square. Marcia leaned back slightly, her dark blazer crisp and her expression faintly approving, as if she were watching a well-executed play. She didn't notice the teenager just 3 feet away who was live-streaming the entire encounter, the comments section of the video already exploding with thousands of viewers demanding the officer's name. One man in the background shouted, "We saw what you did, officer. You didn't even check the store." But Collins merely tightened his grip on Sharon's arm, his face flush with a pride that blinded him to the reality of the situation. He dismissed the crowd with a sneer, confident that his word and Marcia's status would outweigh any footage recorded by regular civilians. Sharon looked around at the circle of recording phones, her eyes showing not a flicker of panic, but a grim, cold determination. She knew that while Collins and Marcia were ignoring the truth, the world was watching it in real time. Every angle of the incident, the false accusation, the refusal to look at the store's security cameras, and the brutal strike, was being backed up to the cloud, creating an unerasable record that no precinct power could cover up. As Collins began to lead her away toward his patrol car, Marcia smoothed her hair with a gloved hand, clearly believing she had one. Neither of them realized that the digital evidence currently circulating through the city's networks was already moving faster than they could drive, reaching the very high-ranking officials who would soon dismantle their lives. The heavy iron doors of the precinct swung open with a hollow clang, but the atmosphere inside provided no sanctuary for the truth. Officer Drew P. Collins marched Sharon L. Payne through the station with a rigid, authoritative posture, his hand still clamped firmly onto her arm, as if she were a dangerous fugitive rather than a victim of his own unchecked temper. Following closely behind was Marcia T. Miller, her dark blazer pristine and her expression composed with a faintly satisfied approval that suggested she owned every square inch of the building. As they moved toward the processing desk, Marcia didn't hide her delight. She leaned in toward Sharon, her voice a low, venomous silk that carried through the sterile hallway. "Did you really think your little performance on the street would work?" Marcia mocked, her eyes glinting with malicious privilege. "In this city, people like me are the law, and people like you are just a nuisance to be cleared away." Collins shoved Sharon toward a hard wooden bench, his face still flush with the pride of a man who believed his badge made him invincible. He ignored the quiet, grim determination in Sharon's eyes, seeing only the passive girl in the gray t-shirt he had struck moments before. Marcia stood by the desk, crossing her arms and looking down at Sharon with a sneer. "I hope you enjoy the view from the cell," Marcia gloated, her tone dripping with the arrogance of someone who had successfully used a police officer as her personal muscle. "By the time I'm done with my statement, they'll throw away the key. You picked the wrong person to cross, honey." Collins nodded in agreement, already pulling out the arrest forms to finalize the false report, completely disregarding the fact that Sharon had not been allowed a single word in her own defense. As Collins began to boast to his fellow officers about cleaning up the streets, Marcia continued her barrage of insults, her mockery echoing off the cold precinct walls. She spoke loudly about her influence and her friendship with high-ranking officials, intending to crush Sharon's spirit before the booking process even began. "You look so small sitting there," Marcia laughed, leaning against the counter. "Just another nameless face in the system. Nobody is coming to save you." Sharon remained silent, her face turned slightly to hide the deepening red mark of the slap, but her mind was far from broken. She watched as Collins and Marcia shared a conspiratorial look, two bullies convinced that their status and power had made them untouchable. Neither of them noticed the desk sergeant's phone beginning to ring incessantly, or the way the other officers in the room were starting to glance at their own mobile screens with expressions of mounting horror. The gloating was loud, but the digital storm brewing outside the station was about to become deafening. The fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed with a sterile, indifferent buzz, casting a harsh glow over the room as Officer Drew P. Collins tossed a thick stack of paperwork onto the desk. He looked at Sharon with a triumphant, mocking glint in his eyes, expecting to see her break. He wanted tears, a frantic plea for mercy, or at the very least, a panicked admission of guilt. Marcia T. Miller stood beside him, her dark blazer sharp against the drab station walls, her arms folded as she waited for the street girl to finally crumble. But Sharon L. Payne did neither. She sat on the hard wooden bench with her back perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The red mark on her cheek had deepened into a bruise, a silent testament to the officer's brutality, yet her expression remained as unshakable as stone. "You're awfully quiet for someone facing grand larceny charges," Collins sneered, leaning over the counter to loom over her. "Usually, your type is screaming about how unfair the world is by now. Don't you have anything to say for yourself before I process these prints?" Marcia let out a short, jagged laugh, her eyes scanning Sharon's simple gray t-shirt with a look of pure disgust. She's realized that her luck has run out, Drew. She knows that in a room full of officers, nobody is going to listen to a word she says. Sharon finally raised her head, her eyes meeting Collins's with a clarity that made the officer's rigid posture falter for a split second. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't offer a single word of defense for the crime she hadn't committed. "I have no intention of arguing with you, Officer Collins," she said, her voice low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "I am well aware of my rights, even if you are not. I refuse to answer any further questions without my legal counsel present." The precinct seemed to go quiet for a heartbeat as her words hung in the air, articulated with a precision that didn't match the vagrant persona Marcia had tried to project onto her. Collins felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, but he quickly masked it with a forced, booming laugh. "Counsel? You think a public defender is going to jump out of bed for a shoplifter at this hour? You're delusional." Sharon didn't blink. She looked directly at the desk sergeant, who was currently staring at his computer screen with a look of mounting confusion. "According to protocol, I am entitled to one phone call," she stated firmly. "I would like to make that call now." Marcia rolled her eyes, checking her watch with an air of bored impatience. "Let her make her little call, Drew. Let her tell her friends that she's going to be spending the night in a cell. It won't change the fact that my heirloom is missing and she's the one who took it." Collins shrugged, sliding a heavy, tethered desk phone toward Sharon with a dismissive gesture. "Go ahead, call whoever you want, but don't expect them to be able to do anything once the commissioner sees my report." Sharon stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful despite the circumstances. She picked up the receiver and dialed a number she knew by heart. The room was silent as everyone listened, Marcia wearing a composed, satisfied smile, waiting for the girl to beg for bail money. When the line connected, Sharon spoke only a few words, but they were words that caused the air in the room to shift. "Hello, Father," she said, her voice echoing off the cold precinct tiles. "I'm at the Midtown precinct. I've been falsely accused of theft by a woman named Marcia Miller, and I was just assaulted by an officer, Drew Collins. I need you to come down here, and Father, please bring the chief. Tell Judge Payne it's urgent." She set the receiver back in its cradle with a soft click. The name Judge Payne rippled through the room like a physical shock. The desk sergeant froze, his hand hovering over the keyboard, while the blood slowly drained from Officer Collins's face. Marcia's satisfied smile twitched and then vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp flicker of doubt. Sharon returned to her seat on the bench, her eyes fixed on the door, her calm demeanor now feeling less like passivity and more like the silent approach of a storm. The precinct, usually a bastion of controlled chaos, was suddenly submerged in an eerie, digital silence that preceded a storm. Officer Drew P. Collins stood frozen by the booking desk, his eyes darting between the calm, bruised face of Sharon L. Payne and the desk sergeant, whose hands were now shaking as they hovered over a smartphone. The unbelievable was no longer a distant threat. It was unfolding in the palm of every officer in the room. On the screen, the video, captured by the diverse crowd on the street just 30 minutes prior, had transcended the local neighborhood. It wasn't just a clip, it was a wildfire. The hashtag Justice for Sharon was trending globally, and the footage of Collins's hand striking Sharon's face was being replayed millions of times, accompanied by the clear, sharp audio of Marcia T. Miller's mocking laughter. Marcia, sensing the sudden shift in the room's temperature, adjusted her dark blazer, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. "What is everyone staring at?" she demanded, her voice shrill and defensive. "Why isn't she in a cell yet? Drew, finish the paperwork." But Collins didn't move. He was staring at a notification on his own phone, a direct alert from the department's public affairs office. The video had reached the mayor and the chief of police before the ink on his false arrest report had even dried. The digital evidence was irrefutable. It showed the boutique security camera clearly visible in the background, a camera Collins had explicitly refused to check, proving his negligence was as deliberate as his violence. The silence inside the station was shattered not by a phone call, but by a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to rise from the very pavement outside. It began as a muffled murmur and grew into a deafening roar of 100 voices chanting in unison. No justice, no peace. Drop the charges. The crowd from the shopping district had followed the patrol car, and they had brought friends. Through the glass doors of the precinct, the blue and red strobe lights of parked cruisers illuminated a sea of people holding up their phones like torches. They weren't just onlookers anymore. They were a wall of witnesses. Marcia stepped toward the window, her face pale as she saw the sheer number of people gathered to defend the girl in the t-shirt. For the first time, her status offered no protection. The cameras outside were hungry for her reaction. Collins looked at the heavy iron doors, then back at Sharon, who hadn't moved from her bench. She sat amidst the mounting chaos with a terrifyingly serene grace. The calm center of a hurricane she had known was coming. The power dynamic had flipped completely. The precinct was no longer a place where Collins and Marcia could dictate the truth. It was a glass house, and the world was throwing stones. The roar of the protest outside the precinct doors suddenly intensified, then parted like a sea as a motorcade of black SUVs screeched to a halt at the curb. Inside the station, the air grew thick with a sudden, suffocating pressure. Officer Drew P. Collins stood paralyzed, his rigid posture now looking more like the stiffness of a corpse than a man in command. The heavy doors burst open, and Police Commissioner Marcus Sterling swept into the room, his face a mask of thunderous fury. He didn't look at the desk sergeant, and he didn't look at the crowd outside. His eyes scanned the room with predatory intent until they landed on the wooden bench. Marcia T. Miller, still clinging to the wreckage of her arrogance, stepped forward, her dark blazer cinched tight as she tried to regain her footing. "Commissioner, thank goodness you're here," she began, her voice pitching up in a desperate attempt at her usual composed charm. "This vagrant girl has caused a riot, and your officer was simply—" The commissioner didn't even let her finish. He brushed past her with such force that she stumbled back against the booking counter. He stopped directly in front of Sharon, his breathing heavy, his eyes widening in genuine horror as he took in the sight of the dark, blossoming bruise on her cheek. The entire precinct held its breath. "Sharon," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking the silence of the room. He reached out a hand, then pulled it back as if afraid to touch the evidence of the crime. "Sharon Payne? My God. Child, what has happened to you?" Sharon looked up, her gaze steady and devoid of the panic everyone expected. "Hello, Marcus," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made every officer in the room feel the floor shifting beneath them. "I was just being processed for grand larceny. Apparently, my presence on a public sidewalk was enough to warrant a theft charge and a physical lesson in authority." The commissioner spun around, his fury erupting like a volcano. He looked at Collins, who looked as though he might faint, the blood having completely drained from his face. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Sterling roared, his voice shaking the glass partitions of the station. "You struck the daughter of Judge Elias Payne? You arrested a woman who has sat at my own dinner table. A woman who has dedicated her life to the city's youth foundations and civil rights boards while you were out here playing God with a badge." Marcia's jaw dropped, her composed facade shattering into a million pieces. The unbelievable truth had finally settled over the room. The girl in the simple gray t-shirt wasn't a nameless nobody they could bury in the system. She was the one person in the city who could dismantle their lives with a single phone call. The commissioner turned his burning gaze toward Marcia. "And as for you, Marcia Miller, I've seen the video. I've seen the boutique's footage that was just uploaded to my office. You didn't just lie. You weaponized this department for a personal vendetta against a woman who has more integrity in her bruised cheek than you have in your entire social circle." Collins tried to speak, his voice a pathetic squeak. "Sir, I didn't know," the report said. "You didn't care to know," Sterling bellowed. "You saw a girl you thought was powerless, and you decided to be a bully." He turned to the desk sergeant, who was frantically trying to delete the digital entry of the arrest. "Get her out of those cuffs, now." And don't you dare look away from me while you do it. As the metal clicked open and Sharon stood up, regaining her full height and dignity, the realization sank in for everyone present. The storm hadn't just arrived. It was only beginning, and it was going to wash every bit of corruption out of this precinct, starting with the man who had raised his hand against the wrong girl. The chaos of the precinct provided a thin veil of noise, and Officer Drew P. Collins tried to use it to his advantage. As Commissioner Sterling continued to comfort Sharon, Collins retreated toward the back of the station, his boots heavy and clumsy on the linoleum floor. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew the video on the internet was damning, but his own body cam footage, which recorded his perspective and the audio of his blatant refusal to check the boutique's cameras, was the final nail in his coffin. If he could just wipe the local server before the footage synced to the main department cloud, he might be able to claim technical malfunction or argue that the viral video was edited to look worse than it was. He reached his terminal in the dark corner of the squad room, his fingers trembling as he punched in his access code. His rigid authority had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate, sweating panic. He navigated to the digital evidence locker, his eyes darting toward the hallway every few seconds. He found the file, Incident 4092 Sharon Payne. His mouse hovered over the delete icon, but before he could click, the screen froze. A massive red dialog box appeared across his monitor, glowing with an ominous light. Access denied, system under audit. Step away from the keyboard, Collins. A cold, clinical voice commanded from behind him. Collins jumped, nearly knocking over his chair. Standing there was a small team of investigators in plain suits, led by a woman with a sharp, uncompromising gaze. They weren't from his precinct. They were internal affairs. While he had been busy gloating to Marcia Miller, the commissioner had already authorized a remote lockdown of every server in the building. I was just making sure the upload was complete, ma'am, Collins stammered, his face a ghostly shade of gray. The lead investigator didn't even look at him. She stepped past him and inserted a secure hardware key into the terminal. The upload was completed 10 minutes ago, officer, and it's already been reviewed. We saw the slap. We heard you tell the suspect that you didn't need a camera to tell you she was guilty. We also found for other malfunction videos from your previous shifts that our technicians just recovered. The tables hadn't just turned. They had been flipped entirely. Collins looked back toward the main desk, seeing Marcia Miller being led into a small, windowless interrogation room, her dark blazer now looking like a funeral shroud. He realized then that the system he had used as a shield for his own cruelty had now become a cage. Internal Affairs began systematically unplugging his hardware, securing the digital trail of his downfall, while the rest of the precinct watched in a stunned, heavy silence. The man who thought he could erase the truth was now being erased from the force. The small, windowless interrogation room felt like a vacuum, stripping away the oxygen of Marcia T. Miller's self-assurance. She sat stiffly on the metal chair, her dark blazer, once a symbol of her unassailable social standing, now looking stark and out of place against the peeling gray paint of the precinct walls. Across from her sat a veteran detective whose expression remained as unreadable as a stone wall. Marcia tried to maintain her composed, satisfied smile, but it flickered and died under the weight of the silence. "This is a ridiculous waste of everyone's time," she snapped, her voice pitching into a shrill, desperate register. "I have already given my statement. That girl stole a family heirloom. I am the victim here, and I expect to be treated with the respect my family's name deserves." The detective didn't reach for a notepad. Instead, he simply slid a tablet across the table. On the screen, the high-definition footage from the boutique security camera played in a continuous loop. It showed Sharon L. Payne standing calmly on the sidewalk, never once crossing the threshold of the store. It showed Marcia herself approaching the girl, pulling the empty velvet box from her own bag, and then waving frantically for Officer Collins. "The camera doesn't care about your family name, Mrs. Miller," the detective said, his voice low and cold. "It only cares about the truth, and the truth is that you lied. You filed a false police report. You instigated a violent assault on a citizen, And you defamed the daughter of a superior court judge in front of a global audience. Marcia's eyes darted to the screen, and for the first time, a genuine tremor of fear passed through her. The status she had wielded like a weapon for decades was suddenly useless against the digital reality staring back at her. She realized with a sickening jolt that she couldn't call a favor to fix this. The video had been seen by millions, and the city's legal department was already preparing a defamation suit that would dismantle her estate. "It was a mistake," she stammered, her hands fumbling with the lapel of her blazer. I must have been mistaken about which girl." "Save it for your arraignment," the detective interrupted, standing up and casting a long shadow over her. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice to ruin a life because you didn't like the way it looked at you. Now you're going to pay the price that the law demands from everyone, regardless of what they're wearing." As he walked to the door, the heavy click of the lock signaled the end of Marcia's reign of privilege. The woman who had lived her life looking down on others was finally seeing the world from the bottom of a cold, indifferent cell. The morning light filtered through the precinct's reinforced windows, but it brought no warmth to Drew P. Collins. He stood in the center of the squad room, his uniform, once his greatest source of pride, now feeling like a weight designed to crush him. The commissioner stood before him, flanked by the stone-faced internal affairs team. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaotic mockery that had filled the space only hours before. With a slow, deliberate motion, the commissioner reached out and unclipped the badge from Collins's chest. "You didn't just break the law, Drew," the commissioner said, his voice a low, disappointed rumble. "You betrayed every man and woman who wears this uniform with honor. You are no longer an officer of this city." A junior officer, the same one Collins had been boasting to earlier, stepped forward with a pair of standard-issue handcuffs. The irony was heavy in the air as the cold steel ratcheted shut around Collins's wrists, the same sound Sharon had heard when she was being silenced. Collins's rigid, authoritative posture finally collapsed. His shoulders slumped, and he stared at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of his former colleagues. The bully had been disarmed, not by force, but by the very truth he had tried to suppress. Behind him, Marcia Miller was led out in a separate set of restraints, her dark blazer wrinkled and her face a mask of tear-streaked panic, finally realizing that her wealth offered no immunity against a video seen by millions. Sharon L. Payne stood near the exit, her father, Judge Elias Payne, standing tall beside her. The red mark on her cheek had begun to fade into a badge of courage. She looked at Collins one last time, not with hatred, but with a quiet, profound pity. She didn't need to say a word. The victory was written in the way she held her head high. As she pushed open the heavy glass doors of the precinct, the low murmur of the waiting crowd erupted into a deafening roar of cheers. Hundreds of people, who had spent the night standing in the cold to demand justice, raised their phones not to record a crime, but to celebrate a triumph. The sunlight hit Sharon's face as she descended the station steps, a simple girl in a gray t-shirt who had brought the powerful to their knees. She had gone out that day wanting to be simply herself, and in doing so, she had reminded the entire city that the law belongs to the innocent, not the influential. As the motorcade pulled away, the cheers of the crowd echoed through the city streets, a final, thunderous reminder that while a bully might have the power to strike, the truth has the power to change everything.